The world of Althea had not seen violence in 300 years. Its twin moons bathed the jungles and cities in soft silver light, and the people, both human settlers and native alien tribes, lived under a fragile but honored peace treaty. But peace is a strange thing. It can blind the wise and lull the strong. When the sky cracked open with fire and warships poured in, no one expected the ones behind the attack would be the treaty guardians themselves. It started with the disappearances. A scout unit vanished near the border mountains. Then a science outpost went silent. At first, people blamed weather, wild creatures, or mechanical failure. But when the third disappearance came with a screaming audio message, cut off mid-sentence, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The invaders came in machines shaped like flying daggers. They didn't broadcast warnings. They didn't take prisoners. Entire settlements were scorched to ash before alarms even sounded. Some believed the attackers were pirates. Others thought it was a rogue empire. But it wasn't. It was the Council humans. Called it the United Coalition of Peacekeeping Species. But to the alien girl named Valinari, they were simply the chain-bearers. She had seen their black banners in her nightmares since childhood. She never thought they were real. Until they descended from orbit and took her people in shackles. Valinari was no stranger to combat. Her mother had trained her in the sacred arts of the jungle hunt. Her arms bore the inked stripes of her clan's warriors. But that day, she was unarmed, caught in meditation. Her entire village burned around her as armored giants seized her by the throat and chained. Her limbs like a beast. They didn't ask for surrender. They demanded obedience. When her father refused, they broke his back in front of the crowd and smiled as he died in silence. Her mother spat on their boots and was struck down too. Valinari screamed not in fear, but in rage. Was not just any alien girl. She was the daughter of the matron bloodline of Cyrakel, bonded by spirit to the great tigers of the jungle. But none of that mattered to the council soldiers. They saw only a symbol to break, a name to erase, and a message to send. She was chained. In the center of the battlefield, her arms stretched outward to rusting poles. A crowd of captives was forced to watch as soldiers prepared to quarter her, tear her apart limb by limb, to prove no one was above the council's law. A human soldier watched from the edge of the chaos. His name was Micah Roan. He had fought in Earth's last war before becoming a wanderer among the stars. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was off duty, a traveler passing through. But when he saw what they planned to do to her, something inside him burned. Micah was not a hero. He didn't believe in fairy tales. But he remembered what it felt like to kneel beside a dying friend, whispering promises to protect the innocent. And he remembered what it felt like when those promises shattered. He had lived with the weight ever since. He stepped forward, one man against 100. No one noticed him at first. The crowd's attention was on the chains. The soldiers were tightening them. The metal groaned. The alien girl closed her eyes not in fear, but in defiance. She would not scream. She would not give them her pain. Micah moved faster than reason. A soldier turned and saw him, but too late. Micah's boot cracked the soldier's helmet and sent him crashing into a generator core. Sparks flew. More guards shouted. Lasers were drawn. And still Micah ran. The chains holding the alien girl glowed under pressure. She gritted her teeth, her arms stretched to breaking point. But then before the final pull, Micah reached her. His knife tore through the first chain like it was made of cloth. The crowd gasped. The soldiers opened fire. Valinari twisted. Her body, and with the chain loosened, yanked her other arm free. Her eyes burned with alien fury. Micah handed her the broken link, and she wrapped it around her fist. Together they moved like a storm. Valinari struck with feral precision, using her chains like whips. Micah shielded her back, blocking stun rounds with salvaged armor. The two of them danced between gunfire and smoke, turning a public execution into an uprising. The people watching had never seen anything like it. A human and an alien girl, both marked for death, now turning the battlefield into a stage of resistance. Chains no longer bound her. They became her weapon. By the time the last soldier fell, the jungle winds blew silent. Smoke drifted through the trees. The only sound left was her breathing and his heartbeat. Velinari looked at him, her body bruised but unbroken, and asked one word. Why? Micah didn't know how to answer. Not yet. But he knew this wasn't the end. The council would come for them both now. And this war had only just begun. Velinari walked barefoot through the wet leaves. Her broken chains still hung from her wrists, clinking softly as she moved. Behind her, Micah scanned the jungle with every step. He had no idea where she was taking them, but he knew stopping wasn't an option. The soldiers would regroup. The council wouldn't accept what happened as a simple escape. They would send hunters, drones, worse things. Micah had seen their black armor enforcers once before on a desert moon. He still remembered the fires. Velinari didn't speak much. Her jaw was tight, her breath steady, her face unreadable. Yet every motion in her body showed purpose. She wasn't wandering. She was leading him somewhere specific. She knew this. Land, it was hers. Micah's boots crunched against roots and stone. He looked up to see massive trees twisting into the sky. Strange glowing creatures darted between vines. The air smelled of moss and static energy. This world was alien. But it was alive. After an hour of silence, they came to a cave carved into the side of a black stone cliff. Without a word, Velinari ducked inside. Micah hesitated at the entrance. He didn't fear the dark. He feared her silence. Inside the cave, faint green lights pulsed from crystal veins in the walls. Velinari knelt beside a pool of still water. She dipped her hand into it and pressed her fingers to her neck. The stripes on her skin glowed softly in response. Micah leaned against the wall. He removed his cracked chest armor and checked the wound on his shoulder. A burn from a council shock rod had left red welts under his skin. He didn't complain. Pain was familiar. But this felt different. This time he chose it. Velinari finally turned to him. Her voice was calm but sharp, like a blade dragged over stone. She asked why he did it. Why a human would risk death for someone like her. Micah stared back and answered with just one word. Justice. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She simply rose to her feet and walked toward him. Her chains clinked again. But now they sounded like armor. Not restraints. She reached into the shadows and pulled out a curved blade. Its edge shimmered like mercury. She offered it to him. Micah hesitated, then took it. The weight was balanced, perfect. He looked at her with confusion. She gave no explanation. That night they slept in shifts. Velinari curled near the wall, her hand never leaving the stone floor. Micah sat near the entrance, blade across his lap, eyes half closed. He knew the jungle had ears. If something approached, he wanted to be the one it met first. When the morning mist rolled in, they moved again, this time faster. Velinari led him through ancient paths marked by stone idols and vines. Once, she stopped and pressed her palm to a tree. The bark pulsed in response, then revealed a hollow space filled with wrapped bundles. Inside were dried fruits, sharp tools, and a carved wooden medallion. She tied the medallion around her neck and handed Micah a fruit. He took it, surprised by its warmth and flavor. It tasted like citrus and fire. As they traveled, Micah noticed signs of battle. Broken spears, scorch marks on stone, empty nests. Trees cut clean through. This wasn't a new war. It had begun long before the council's betrayal. He wondered how many had already died without anyone noticing. Suddenly, the trees opened into a massive crater surrounded by stone walls. In the center was a ruin and old temple built from black glass and ironwood. Velinari stopped and pointed. She said it used to be a place of trials for her people. Now it would become something else. A rebellion. Micah followed her into the Kambara ruins. They descended a spiral stairway into the belly of the temple. Torches lit automatically as she passed, responding to her presence. This place recognized her. It still obeyed her bloodline. At the lowest level was a chamber filled with ancient weapons and armor sealed in crystal. Velinari touched one panel. It hissed and cracked open. She pulled free a gauntlet shaped like a predator's jaw. She slid it onto her arm and flexed her fingers. Micah reached for a shock pistol, but she stopped him. She shook her head and handed him something else. A staff made of coiled metal and bone. When he gripped it, the coil straightened into a long-bladed spear. He looked at her. She met his eyes. There were no smiles. Only fire. Then she said something in her own language. The translation chip embedded in his collar buzzed and whispered the meaning in his ear. If they want war, we'll give them truth instead. Micah understood. They couldn't outgun the council. Not yet, but they could reveal the lies, the betrayals, the killings, the executions. Everything they had hidden under treaties and flags. The first step was survival. The second was message. Velinari knew. The jungle had watchers, old allies. Beasts with minds and wings. Some would listen, some would not. But all would feel the storm coming. That night, a signal was sent from the temple's hidden beacon. It was coded in ancient patterns, the language of the Sirakel tribes. It spread across the planet like smoke. Old warriors, exiles, and jungle kings felt it in their bones. Bloodline walks again. In the distance, beyond mountains and rivers, eyes began to open. Forgotten machines stirred. Stone faces cracked. Lights blinked in the ruins of fallen cities. The call had been made. The chainbreaker had returned, and beside her stood the human who would not kneel. Asterisk. The temple walls echoed with the sound of ancient gears turning. Dust fell from the ceiling as mechanisms long buried awakened to Velinari's touch. She moved through the underground corridors like someone returning to a forgotten throne. Micah followed closely, gripping the coiled spear she had given him. He felt the ground tremble beneath his boots. The deeper they went, the more he realized. This wasn't just a hiding place. This was a fortress built by warriors who refused to die quietly. Velinari placed her palm against a black stone panel. A thin beam of light scanned her stripes, and the massive door before them groaned open. Inside was a chamber glowing with bioluminescent vines and metal roots that pulsed with quiet energy. In the center of the chamber stood a circular platform. Dozens of projection spires rose from the ground around it. This was a war room, once used by Sirakel commanders in the time before peace. Its memories still lived inside the stone. She stepped onto the platform. The projections sparked to life, revealing a map of the continent above. Council outposts glowed in red. Abandoned villages blinked in blue. Symbols danced across the surface like moving shadows. Velinari studied them in silence. Micah stepped beside her. He didn't understand the language, but he recognized the pattern. The enemy was spreading like poison. They weren't just conquering, they were erasing. Every outpost marked in red meant another part of her culture burned or buried. She pointed to one location blinking with a golden pulse. The translation on Micah's device called it the Seed Vault. It was the last known sanctuary of Sirakel genetic records, knowledge, and sacred rites. If the council reached it, her entire lineage would be lost. Micah asked how far it was. She answered with a number he didn't want to hear. It was across enemy territory, guarded by drones and aerial sentries. No clear roads, no allies nearby, but her eyes held no fear. Only purpose. She turned off the map and led him back up through the temple. On the way, they passed a mirror of polished obsidian. Micah caught a glimpse of himself beside her. He looked Nothing like the soldier who had once walked away from Earth's wars. He looked like someone reborn in battle. When they emerged from the temple, the sky above was thick with gray clouds. Thunder rolled in the distance. Velinari tilted her head toward the wind and closed her eyes. Micah watched her for a moment. Then they moved again. They journeyed through thick jungle, across cracked stone bridges and beneath fallen arches. The ruins of old Sirakel cities whispered beneath vines and branches. Velinari never spoke of them, but her silence carried. Morning. As night approached, they made camp beneath the roots of a giant tree. Micah set up a small heat orb, while Velinari gathered moss and leaves to mask their scent. The council's trackers could follow a footprint days after it vanished. Over the fire, Micah asked her about the tigers. The ones bonded to her clan. She nodded and reached into her pack. She removed a carved pendant shaped like a tiger's eye. She placed it near the firelight. It shimmered and cast shadows that moved on their own. She said they were not just animals. They were guardians born of spirit and flesh. Each warrior of her bloodline was paired with one at birth. But hers had vanished the day the warships came. She believed it was still alive, waiting for her. Micah asked what would happen if they reached the vault. Could it change the war? She said the vault did not hold weapons. It held truth. And in this kind of war, truth was the sharpest blade. In the early hours before dawn, a low growl echoed through the trees. Micah grabbed his spear. Velinari crouched and placed her palm on the soil. The vibration told her all she needed to know. It wasn't a beast. It was a machine. Moments later, a scout drone drifted above the canopy. Its red eye scanned the forest floor. Micah pulled Velinari beneath a moss-covered ledge. They held their breath as the drone's beam passed inches away from them. Velinari whispered a short phrase in her native tongue. A nearby flower bloomed suddenly, releasing a cloud of spores. The drone's sensors blurred for a second. Just enough time. She lunged forward, climbed the nearest tree, and launched her chain toward the drone. The chain wrapped around its sensor core. With one violent pull, she slammed it into a stone outcrop. Sparks burst. The machine crashed to the ground, twitching. Micah finished it with a jab from his spear. They didn't celebrate. They moved. Fast. The crash would trigger a signal. More would come. The council didn't lose their machines without asking questions. Velinari knew they had minutes before. The skies darkened. As they ran, the jungle itself seemed to shift in their favor. Vines parted, paths widened. Birds cried warnings from tree to tree. Micah could feel it too. The forest was waking up. It remembered her blood. They reached a cliffside and looked out over a vast canyon. At the far end was a silver dome embedded in stone. It pulsed with blue light. The seed vault, still standing, still sealed, still sacred, but between them and the vault stood a field of black towers. Dozens of them, each one humming with shield emitters and sentinel drones circling like vultures. The council was already there, and they were waiting. Velinari crouched beside Micah. Her voice was low but clear. This would not be a battle they could win with strength. It would require speed, silence, precision, and the will to die if it meant awakening something greater. Micah nodded. He had followed her this far, not because of duty, not because of honor, but because she had shown him that hope wasn't dead. Not yet. Not while chains could still be broken, and not while truth still had a voice. Asterisk. Micah crouched low behind a ridge of black stone, eyes locked on the field of towers ahead. Sentinel drones hovered in steady loops, their scanning lights sweeping back and forth across the jungle floor. Each tower was armed. Micah could see rotating barrels and emitter nodes glowing faintly beneath armor plates. These weren't just sensors. They were weapons, designed to fire at anything that moved without clearance. Velinari lay flat beside him, her hand pressed into the earth. She murmured in her native tongue and let her breath slow. The soil beneath her fingers responded with warmth. She whispered a word, and the moss shifted underfoot like it was listening. Micah didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. This jungle wasn't just alive, it was aware. And it still remembered who she was. Velinari pointed to the far left edge of the field. A broken cliffside had collapsed there, creating a shadowed path beneath the towers. If they moved silently and with speed, they could cross the gap without being seen. The two of them sprinted forward in bursts. When the drones turned, they dropped flat behind stones and roots. When the lights passed, they moved again. Inch by inch, they made their way across the field. Halfway through, a soft clicking noise echoed above them. A new drone dropped lower. Then the rest, scanning deeper. Micah froze in place. The drone hovered just above his head, its beam slowly drifting toward his boots. Velinari reached into her pouch and removed a shard of mirror stone. She threw it toward the far tree line. The shard hit a rock and reflected light in a sudden flash. The drone turned instantly, following the light. That was enough time. They dove into the collapsed cliffside tunnel. Inside, roots and rock sealed them from view. Micah exhaled, wiping sweat from his forehead. Velinari touched his shoulder and gave a silent nod. They were not safe yet, but they had crossed the worst of it. The tunnel led upward, spiraling behind the seed vault. As they climbed, the air changed. It became warmer, filled with a soft vibration like distant music. Micah paused. He had heard strange sounds before, but never anything that felt alive inside his chest. At the top of the tunnel, a circular door stood between them and the vault. Velinari placed both hands on the surface. Her tattoos pulsed with light. The metal reacted, shifting color from silver to blue, then opened with a hiss. Inside was a cathedral of glass and root. Massive branches wrapped around ancient machines. Floating spheres displayed symbols in mid-air. Runes glowed on the walls in her native script. It was not just a vault. It was a memory chamber. Velinari stepped forward and touched a panel. A soft voice filled the air. It spoke in the language of the ancients. The translation came through Micah's collar after a pause. It said this vault held the recorded spirit of the Cyrakel. Micah watched as hundreds of images flickered to life. Warriors training, children bonding with jungle beasts, leaders standing beneath stormlit skies. He saw Velinari's people as they had once been proud, strong, unbroken. She walked among the lights with quiet reverence. Each projection she passed responded to her presence. One image stopped her completely. It showed a woman who looked like her older, but with the same fire in her eyes. Her mother, Micah, stood beside her without a word. He could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands trembled slightly. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But her silence was heavier than grief. Suddenly, the entire chamber shook. Lights flickered. An alert tone sounded across the ceiling. Velinari turned sharply. Micah looked at the door. The scanners had picked up something outside. A projection screen formed near them, showing an outside view. Council forces had arrived. Dozens of black-armored enforcers. They marched through the jungle in precise formation. A dropship hovered behind them, preparing for landing. Velinari turned to the memory core. She activated the vault's defense protocols. A second door sealed behind them. Energy shields formed across the walls. But she knew it wouldn't be enough. Not forever. Micah grabbed his spear and checked the hallway they came from. He looked at her. She shook her head. Fighting here would destroy the very thing they came to protect. The vault wasn't built to be a battlefield. Then she did something unexpected. She stepped into the center of the chamber, placed both hands on the glowing crystal pedestal, and whispered a phrase. The lights dimmed. One by one, the memory orbs vanished into the walls. The pedestal opened and a small seed floated up. It was pure white, encased in glowing mist. The chamber voice called it the heart of Sirakel. It was the last true genetic memory of her people. A living archive that could rebuild a culture from ash. Micah stared at it. It looked fragile. Too small to be worth so much. But the way Valinari held it carefully, like a newborn, told him this was more than data. This was hope. They had to escape. But the only exit was now watched by soldiers. Valinari looked at the walls again. Then she pressed her hand into a root structure. The root twisted and opened a narrow shaft into the earth. It was not safe. It led into the unknown. Old tunnels forgotten by even the jungle itself. But it was the only way. She placed the seed inside a protective pouch and fastened it beneath her tunic. She handed Micah a crystal flare. It would help them see in the dark, but only for minutes at a time. He nodded and dropped into the tunnel. First, the darkness swallowed them. Above, the council soldiers breached the outer perimeter. Explosions echoed as metal met stone. But by the time they reached the chamber, it was empty. The vault was gone. And the last of the Sirakel legacy had vanished into the earth. The tunnel walls were damp and pulsing with faint light, as if the roots themselves were alive. Micah moved slowly, spear in one hand, flare in the other. Valinari followed close behind, her eyes adjusting faster to the shadows than his. They had been underground for nearly 2 hours. The air was thick, almost humming, filled with the scent of minerals and ancient dust. Every few minutes, strange vibrations echoed in the stone, like something massive breathing deep within the earth. The flare in Micah's hand began to fade. Before the last spark died, Valinari pulled a crystal from her pouch and held it up. It caught the last of the flare's glow and lit with a steady blue flame, bathing the tunnel in cool light. Micah looked at her and whispered thanks. She said nothing but pressed onward. They were far beneath the jungle now, deeper than most explorers ever dared to go. This was a forgotten path, built not by machines but by the living roots of her ancestors. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into blackness. Towering tree-like pillars held it aloft, and glowing vines dangled from above like stars suspended in water. In the center of the chamber stood a large pool, its surface still and mirror-like. Valinari approached it slowly and knelt beside the edge. She whispered a word in her native tongue, and the pool lit with green and silver light. Images danced across the surface. Memories, old stories, warnings. This was one of the dream pool's sacred places where the Sirakel stored visions and ancestral knowledge. It was not just a place to rest. It was a place to remember. Micah crouched beside her, watching the lights swirl. One image caught his attention. A vision of chains, blood, and council ships burning the jungle. But behind that, another vision emerged. A human and a Sirakel standing together beneath the same banner. Valinari reached into the water. It accepted her touch without a ripple. The light shifted and poured into her hand. When she stood, her eyes glowed for a brief second. She had taken something from the pool, an ancestral gift. She turned to Micah and held out a small disc. It shimmered with blue and gold patterns. She said it would allow them to contact any ancient guardian still sleeping in the old jungles. If even one answered, the balance of this war could change. Micah accepted it carefully and tucked it into his gear. Then he looked toward a tunnel at the far end of the chamber. He could hear faint sounds from that direction, water dripping, stone shifting, and something else. Movement. They followed the sound, weapons ready. The path narrowed and curved sharply. Suddenly, they emerged into a lower chamber filled with massive roots twisted into shapes like claws and spines. And there, lying among them, was a beast. It was a tiger. But not like any Micah had seen. Its fur shimmered with blue veins. Its claws were made of crystal. One of its fangs was broken, and a wound glowed red across its side. It was breathing, but barely. Valinari gasped and rushed forward. She knelt beside the creature and placed her forehead against its own. The tiger opened one eye, and a soft rumble escaped its throat. This was her bonded guardian. It had survived the invasion, but just barely. She removed the seed from her pouch and pressed it gently to the beast's chest. Light spread across its wounds. The tiger shuddered, then slowly began to breathe deeper. It was not healed, but it was no longer dying. Micah watched in silence. He had seen miracles on battlefields before, but none like this. This was not technology. This was spirit. A connection stronger than weapons or wires. Valinari stood and looked at him. She said the guardian would rest here while they moved forward, but now the jungle would feel her again. Its oldest protector was waking. The council's grip on this world was about to break. As they left the chamber, the tiger let out a deep, echoing roar. It rolled through the roots and stones. Like thunder, above, in the jungle, animals paused. The wind changed direction, and every tree turned its leaves toward the mountains. They climbed higher, following the root-formed steps that led toward daylight. After nearly a full day in the underground, the first shaft of sunlight burned their eyes. But with it came the scent of fresh air and distant rain. When they reached the surface, they found themselves on a cliff overlooking a valley. The seed vault was miles behind them now. In the distance, smoke curled from a council facility. It was a prison camp built into the ruins of an old Sirakel city. Valinari's jaw tightened. She said that place once held songs and ceremonies. Now it held chains and pain. She couldn't pass it without acting. Micah understood. He didn't argue. He simply checked his spear and said they'd need a plan. They waited until dusk. Then they descended the cliffs, moving through the valley shadows like ghosts. They reached the edge of the prison walls just as the suns dipped behind the peaks. Lights flickered on across the compound. Patrols began. Valinari moved first, using vines to climb the outer wall. Micah followed, quieter than a shadow. Inside they saw rows of cages. Sirakel men, women, and children. Some too weak to stand. Others staring blankly into nothing. Micah's hands curled into fists. He had seen war camps before. But this was different. These people were not enemies. They were witnesses. And that made them dangerous to the council's lies. Together, they struck. Valinari disabled the power core while Micah silenced the guards. The chains fell. The cages opened. The prisoners looked at their rescuers with disbelief. Then one child whispered her name. And suddenly they all remembered. The bloodline walks again, and beside her stood the human who broke the chains. The prison gates were torn open. Flames danced along the watchtowers. Smoke curled upward into the twilight sky as the last of the council guards fled or fell. Valinari stood atop the ruined wall, holding the broken control rod of the warden. In her hand, Micah walked beside the freed prisoners, helping those who limped or stumbled. Children clung to his coat. Elders placed trembling hands on his shoulder. They didn't speak the same language, but they understood what he had done. That night, they lit no fires. They rested in the shadows of the ruins, beneath the crumbling statues of Sirakel ancestors. The jungle watched them silently, but without threat. The wind carried no warning. Valinari sat with the children. She told them stories in her native tongue. Stories of the great beasts, the first stars, and the skyfall that brought humans to their world. Micah listened nearby. Her voice was soft but strong, like flowing stone. In the middle of the camp, a ring of warriors stood. They were the strongest among the freed prisoners. Some still wore the shattered pieces of their old armor. Others bore fresh marks of torture. But all of them had one thing in common. They had seen what she had done. They knelt before her without command. One by one, They drew their blades and pressed them into the earth. They spoke the words of return, words not spoken in over 100 years. The old vow, we follow the chain breaker. Micah didn't fully understand the ritual, but he saw its meaning. Valinari had become more than a symbol. She had become movement. She had become flame. The next morning, scouts returned with news. The council was preparing a large strike force. Not just to hunt her, but to erase the entire valley. They had marked it as infected with rebellion. Their answer would be orbital fire. They had 2 days. Valinari did not panic. She did not retreat. She ordered the warriors to gather the people and lead them north to the temple ruins. She and Micah would stay behind, not to die, but to strike. She knew of a mountain pass once used by the Sirakel to trap invading armies. It had long been abandoned, but the roots beneath it still lived. If awakened, they could shift the rocks and collapse the narrow path. The two of them climbed for hours, leaving the valley behind. Storm clouds gathered above, drawn by the disruption in the jungle's energy. Lightning cracked across the peaks. But they pressed forward without pause. When they reached the pass, Micah looked down at the narrow gap between the cliffs. It was perfect. If the enemy marched through it, and they triggered the collapse, the entire first wave would be buried. Before the battle even began, Valinari placed her hands on the earth. She whispered the old words. The roots stirred beneath the stone, but it was not enough. They needed power. They needed a signal strong enough to awaken the mountain. She turned to Micah. She told him that the seed the heart of Sirakel could do it, but once used, it would be gone. Its energy would return to the earth. It would not be recoverable. He looked at her and asked what she chose. She chose her people. He helped her dig into the soil at the cliff's edge. Together, they formed a cradle of roots and placed the seed inside. As her hands hovered over it, light began to pour from her chest. The tattoos on her arms blazed like fire. The ground shook. The cliffside groaned. Rocks began to crack and shift. In the valley below, the first wave of council soldiers appeared. Their banners flapped in the wind. Their machines whirred. But they were too late. With a final cry, Valinari slammed her palm onto the seed. A blast of light shot through the cliffs. The roots exploded from the stone. The pass collapsed with a roar louder than thunder. Dust swallowed the canyon. The council force was gone. Micah pulled her back as the shockwave rushed up the slope. They tumbled together behind a boulder. When the rumbling stopped, she lay still for a moment, eyes closed. Then she opened them and smiled faintly. The mountain had answered. They returned to the jungle 3 days later. The refugees were alive. The warriors had begun fortifying the old temples. Beacons had been lit across the horizon. More tribes were arriving each day. The rebellion was no longer hidden. One night, a messenger arrived, a Sirakel elder from a distant coast. He brought word that the council was furious. But more importantly, he brought news that a vote had been called. The member species were questioning the council's actions. They had seen the footage. They had seen the broken chains. They had seen the girl once meant to be quartered now rise as a leader. Micah stood on the edge of the temple wall, watching the stars. He felt the air shift. Valinari stepped beside him, her presence calm and powerful. She no longer wore her broken chains. Around her wrist now was a bracelet woven from jungle vines and crystal. She said the council would come again. But next time, they wouldn't just face rebels. They would face a people returned to purpose. And they would face the human who chose to break the chains instead of walk away. Micah looked at her, then at the jungle that had once been silent. Now it whispered his name in wind and leaf. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He was ready. The war was not over, but the world was no longer afraid. *. The skies above the temple darkened as massive ships broke through the clouds. Council war vessels, their hulls black and silent, hovered over the jungle like shadows with claws. They came without warning, without mercy, prepared to burn everything below. But they did not find a village of farmers. They found warriors, they found defenders. They found banners raised not in fear, but in unity. The people of Sirakel had risen. Their old songs echoed from cliff to cliff, and their weapons were not made of iron alone. Micah stood at the edge of the temple platform, watching the ships descend. Beside him, Velinari adjusted the band across her chest. It was marked with the symbols of every tribe that had joined the rebellion. The crystal spear in her hand pulsed with light. A voice boomed from the sky, projected from the lead warship. It ordered surrender. It claimed peace. It warned of annihilation. Velinari raised her spear and answered not with words, but with the roar of the jungle. From the trees came beasts the council had forgotten. Great winged serpents and armored stalkers. Machines built by ancestors emerged from the ground, their eyes glowing with ancient fire. The council ships opened fire. But the forest fought back. Micah led a strike team through the undergrowth. His target was the ship's communication node. If they disabled it, the council fleet would be blind. He moved with purpose, his every motion honed by months of battle and belief. Velinari charged toward the central landing craft. She moved like wind and lightning. Her guardian tiger ran beside her, leaping over fire and debris. Its claws tore through armor like paper. Together, they reached the front lines. The jungle burned, but it did not fall. Micah reached the node. He scaled the metallic spine of a fallen drone and leapt onto the structure's base. A soldier stepped into his path. The human spear flashed. Once, the soldier collapsed. He planted the charge and jumped as it exploded behind him. The sky above flickered. The lead ship hesitated. Signals broke. Coordination failed. Council units turned without direction. Velinari took the opportunity. She climbed the fallen tree that had crashed through the vessel's hull and entered the heart of the enemy, inside. The control deck, council officers tried to restore order. They froze when they saw her. One reached for a weapon. She threw her chain. It wrapped around his throat and yanked him backward. The others fell in seconds. She stood among them without a scratch. She activated the central broadcast system. All screens and speakers linked across the battlefield responded. Her voice reached every soldier, every prisoner, every tribe, and every starship orbiting the sky. She spoke of truth. Of what had been stolen. Of what had been erased. She showed the footage of the quartering ground. She showed the chains. She showed her blood on the stones and the human who refused to let her die. She showed the heart of Sirakel, across the stars. All eyes listened. The neutral systems paused. Number species once loyal to the council fell into silence. And then, one by one, their representatives withdrew their support. Micah watched from the tree line as more council ships turned and retreated. One by one, they powered down their weapons and vanished into the clouds. The war was not won by fire alone. It was won by memory, unity, and voice. Velinari stepped out of the control deck. The battlefield had grown still. The people of the jungle began to emerge from their shelters. They did not cheer. They did not shout. They knelt in quiet respect, pressing their hands to the earth. Micah met her in the clearing. His armor was scorched. His blade was chipped, but his eyes were clear. She walked to him, removed the vine-wrapped bracelet from her wrist, and placed it in his hand. He asked what it meant. She said it was not a gift, it was a bond. The same bond that her people gave only to those who chose their world over their own. It meant he was no longer a visitor. He was one of them. Weeks later, the council's upper command collapsed. The worlds once bound by fear opened their borders. The truth Velinari had broadcast became a signal of resistance across the galaxy. The girl they tried to break had become a legend, but she did not stay in palaces. She walked the ruins. She helped rebuild the broken cities. She trained the next generation. And Micah was always at her side. Not because she needed him, but because he chose to remain. One day, beneath the twin suns, a new ceremony was held. The people gathered not in mourning, but in rebirth. A monument was raised not to the war, but to the moment everything changed. A sculpture of broken chains lying at the feet of a woman standing tall, her head high, her eyes fierce. Beside her, a human with his arm outstretched, not holding a weapon, but offering his hand. The inscription below said only one thing: they tied her to be quartered. He broke the chains instead.